least. I can tell you that. Welcome, Paul, and welcome, Rick. You all know that Rick is taking the place of Jan Donkers. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Who is Paul Watkins? To Dutch ears, the name Paul Watkins may seem unfamiliar. The reasons for this I do not really know. The 3 novels he has written so far are all available in Holland. They have been reviewed favorably. His debut, Night Over Day Over Night, was translated and published by Agathon as Dag in Nacht uit. And his second novel, Comet Sunset, Comet Dawn, came out in Holland a month ago in Anneke van Huyseling's translation as Kalm de avond, Kalm de morgen. Now, a possible explanation for his relative obscurity in our country is perhaps the intimidating avalanche of books from new, promising, young, not-to-be-missed authors that seems to come out of Britain, and especially out of the United States, each year. So it's a good thing that we have the John Adams Institute to set things right. How different the state of affairs elsewhere. In Britain, for example, Night Over Day Over Night was shortlisted for the Booker Prize, which is always a guarantee for, if anything else, large sales. Calm at Sunset, Calm at Dawn was given the Encore Award, which is a prize for best second novels, which is a very nice idea, by the way. And his most recent effort, In the Blue Light of African Dreams, was shortlisted for the Sunday Express Book of the Year Award. So, geen kleine jongen, we say in Dutch. I said something nice about you, Paul. Don't worry. A gifted stylist, writing sentences wonderfully evocative in their context, like a new Hemingway, with an incomparably vivid style, compellingly provocative, demonstrating a rare gift for the economical resonant evocation of depths, both psychological and verbal, ranking among the best in the genre, and so on, say the critics on both sides of the Atlantic. So who is Paul Watkins? What sort of a writer is he? Well, let's first talk about what he is not. He is not a member of the Brat Pack. He does not write about the emptiness of yuppie or post-yuppie life in big cities, nor about difficulties in relationships, homo or heterosexual. He does not chronicle modern life in a biting, profoundly sarcastic way. He's not a feminist, he's not a minimalist, and he's not a postmodernist. So what is left, you might ask? Well, first and foremost, Paul Watkins is a storyteller. If your idea of good novel writing is strong stories well told, then Paul Watkins is your man. Let's take a look at the novels and consider their action. In The Blue Light of African Dreams, a young American pilot flying for the French in the Great War is shot down, tries to desert, is captured, and offered the choice between execution or 20 years service in France's Foreign Legion. He then finds himself involved in a half-forgotten war in Morocco under a corrupt commander. He wheedles this commander into giving him his discharge papers, goes to Paris, buys a plane to enter the competition for the first man to cross the Atlantic by plane non-stop. I won't tell you what happens next, but we're only just about halfway in the book so far. In Calm at Sunset, Calm at Dawn, the hero is a young college student who, against the wishes of his fisherman father, opts for a life at sea as a mate on scallop trawlers off the coast of New England to earn enough money to buy a lobster boat and be his own man on home waters. The story involves drug trafficking, domestic crises, and lengthy episodes of the drudgery and the dangers of working at sea. In his first novel, Night Over Day Over Night, the basic premise is that of a young boy in World War II who finds himself with nothing better to do than to join the army to fight for his country against the enemy. The twist to the story is that the boy is German. He joins the Waffen-SS to fight the Allied troops. We follow him through boot camp and then to the Ardennes, where he takes part in the Germans' last all-or-nothing offensive in the winter of 1944. Now, what more does one want in terms of originality of subject matter, stuff for action, and wonderful tales full of sound and fury? Well, a common prejudice against adventure-packed novels is that these tales signify nothing. They are not serious literature with a capital L. Fast-paced, action-studded stories tend, on the whole, to be found entertaining and are then quickly forgotten. Novels like these are often only as good as their plots. Watkins's books are better than that. They offer more than just a good read. Without wanting to get into deep water by trying to answer the question, what is literature and what isn't, there are qualities to Watkins's writing that deserve highlighting. Take his protagonists. They are young men looking for definitions of themselves. Sebastian Westland, SSer, James Pfeiffer, would-be lobsterman, and Charlie Halifax, obsessed with coming home a hero. All three go through experiences of life by choice or by chance that, in the best Bildungsroman tradition, define who they are. They find themselves forced to face violent situations that endanger their lives and challenge their morals. Situations that give them the opportunity to find out what stuff they are made of, a chance to get to know themselves, and a chance for the reader to get to know them. Because apart from dream and daydream sequences that occur in each novel, in which lines between fact and fiction, dream and reality, lie and truth blur, there are hardly any glimpses inside Watkins's characters. There's little introspection. There are few passages of lengthy dialogue. Watkins's main characters are not articulate. They do and dream rather than talk or think. And in doing, they are revealed to themselves and to the reader. In this way, even though they are neither particularly sympathetic nor particularly unsympathetic, Watkins makes his readers care about his protagonists. We want to know what happens not only to the plot line, but even more, we want to know what the outcome of this search for the self will be. What lends Paul Watkins' works a further dimension of quality is, I think, that he is a craftsman who not only plots his stories well, but writes them well also. He builds his stories on sensory perceptions. He has a perfect ear, eye, nose, and touch for the correct telling detail. His language, to use an image that I hope will come across, comes in waves of tight, concentrated pebbles of action that rattle around your imagination and sweep you along with their rhythm. Watkins is at his best in the scenes where he pits his heroes against the natural elements, the fire of wars and crashes, the earth of woods, coal mines, and deserts, the wind of the storms at sea and in the air, the water of the ocean. It is in these scenes in particular that he achieves a lyrical quality that is gripping. Now, before I lose myself further in murky imagery or blurby language, I would like to read you an example of his prose from Comet Sunset, Calm at Dawn. It is towards the end of the book, and the main character, James Pfeiffer, has been under great strain and is ready to crack. At sunrise, I was walking the deck. I gathered fish that came up in the dredges and flipped them into a basket. They were winter fluke with thick green skin, white bellies, and bubble eyes. I dug the nail of the fish pick into the meat of their backs and jerked them into a slime-covered basket. Sun shone in dull gray strips on the water. As I moved to pick up the basket, a big crab reached from the deck and grabbed my thumb. Its claws were black at the ends, as if they had been hardened in a fire. I cried out and shook my hand, but the crab stayed on, legs tugged under its shell, mouth plate sliding back and forth. I swung the crab against the ice hatch and broke the claw off its body. The crab dropped to the floor and started crawling away, the claw still gripped at my thumb. By squeezing the muscle behind its first joint, I made the claw let go. Then I ground the crab into the deck with my heel. We had just pulled the dredges on deck when Nelson appeared from the bunk room and walked towards the stern to take a piss. He stood with his hands on the small of his back, looking at the water. Suddenly he shouted, "It's a man! A man!" I moved to get a better look and saw the head of the man in the water. He rose up on the crest of one wave and disappeared into the trough of another. He wore a survival suit. Gil had already begun to wheel the boat around. We waved and called to the man, but as we pulled close, I saw his eyes were closed, his mouth shut tight. He looked old, and his eyebrows were gray. We passed him once and couldn't reach him, so we turned and tried again. His arms spread out from his body, and the fingers waved like seaweed at the end. Glow strips on the suit reflected the sun's weak light. Pitsley and Nelson pulled him to the boat with a rubber-tipped gaff hook and then heaved him over the side with a rope. His heels slapped hard on the deck. "Dead man!" Pitsley shouted in my ears. "We got us a corpse." I picked up my fish basket again, not wanting to touch the man if I didn't have to. The dead man's survival suit looked weathered. A few barnacles grew on the rubber. We crowded around and looked down at his face. It had been hardened by the sea. His eyebrows were crusted with salt, and the skin was pulled tight on the bones. Behind the closed eyelids, his eyes had sunk into his head. The lips were thin strips stretched over the teeth, and his nostrils 2 fat, shriveled holes. Gil turned the man over with the toe of his boot. I held my breath as I stepped close. On the back, in faded letters, I read, "Blow whistle to attract attention. Relax. Remember, you cannot sink." "You want me to call the Coast Guard?" Howard wiped his hands on his trousers, even though he had not touched the body. Gil rocked on his heels with the strike of a wave against the boat. "What for? He's already dead. Throw him back over." Without a word, Pitsley and Nelson picked the man up by his arms and started dragging him towards the gap in the stern. I took another look at the man's face and smooth shape of his forehead tucked into the survival suit's hood. Then I took another pace forward, my eyes fixed on the face. A sharp jolt punched through my ribs. "It's my dad." "What?" Pitsley and Nelson dropped the man. His head fell with a crack on the deck. I began to breathe very fast, feeling the same shudders that had run through me when Kelly died. "It's my dad." I knelt next to the body and put my hands on either side of his head, my thumbs against the freezing cold skin. "My dad." I looked up at the faces of the people around me. "My dad," I tried to say again, but only crackled in my throat. I wrapped my arms around his chest and began to carry him towards the galley. The body was heavier than I thought, and my knees were shaking. I fell over with the body on top of me. "Help me carry my dad." I stood up, took hold of the arm, and pulled. Gil set his hand on my shoulder and squeezed. "What are you talking about, Fife? What makes you think this is your dad?" "I know him from his face." I bent over and took the man's head in my hands. My mouth locked open, and I felt myself choking. "You don't know anybody from that face." "It's my dad." Something acid rose up from my throat and spilled down the side of my mouth. "You told me your dad wasn't fishing anymore, Fife." I breathed in and breathed in again, but the air was thin and empty. "He went out a couple of days ago with a friend. He was going as mate, just for a couple of trips." I groped behind for the ice hatch and sat down, a painful heaviness in my guts. "Pfeiffer," Gil's face appeared in front of me, jaw muscles in 2 bars down the side of his cheek. This man has been out here for a lot longer than a couple of days. This man has been dead a long time. Now you," his finger jabbed out of focus close to my sight, "you saw your dad only a day or two ago, right?" "Yes, 3 days ago." "Well then, I know him from his eyes." I bent down and pulled back the man's eyelids with my thumb. The pupils were gone, rolled back into his head. Only the white remained. I stood up and screamed in Gil's face, "It's my dad!" Gil took hold of my collar and lifted me onto the tips of my toes. My nose fizzed and tears ran down my face. Gil shook me. "Did you see him a couple of days ago or not?" "Yes." I dabbed at my eyes with the tips of my fingers. He turned to Pitsley. "Then get this floater out of here." Gil faced me again. "There's barnacles on the suit. He's been out here for ages. Now, it's not your father, and you know it." Pitsley took the man's arms and dragged him towards the gap in our stern. "We can't just leave him out here." I tried to push Gil aside, but he held on to me, his hands gripping my skin through the material of my coat. "If we put him down in the ice room and hand him over to the police when we get back, they declare the catch contaminated and we lose it. We lose the whole thing. Now this man is dead, and you don't know him, and you can't help him. He doesn't care where he is. He's a piece of driftwood now. Do you understand? You can't leave him out here by himself." I hung in the grip of Gil's hand on my collar. "What are you talking about?" I shrugged my shoulders, the heaviness in my stomach pulling me down. "Can't." I looked up. The rest of the crew was watching me. I stared down at the deck, ashamed. They threw the man over. I saw the ball of his head bob up on the wave crests. Then he was gone in the dullness of the broken sea. "Send these dredges down." Gil snapped his finger at us and returned to the wheelhouse. I heard the clank of chains, the hum of cable running loose. So, before I finally stop, who is Paul Watkins, the man? He will tell you all about himself and his work in a minute, and before he does, I would like to touch upon two things that I find particularly interesting. His family history is as exotic as his plot lines. His father, from a Welsh mining family, settled in the United States after competing in the British javelin throwers team in the Olympics, sent Paul at age 6 to Dragon School, Oxford, and Eton for a very British education. Watkins then returned to the States to study at Yale University, French and Italian. In short, he is bicultural, mid-Atlantic. And what advantages and drawbacks does that bring a novelist? What, to name just one thing, does it do to your voice? He's been trained in the craft of good writing. Taking a creative writing course in New York helped him decide to try a writing career. What exactly does a course like that entail? How does it help your art? Questions like these and more. After the break, let us first listen to the man himself, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Watkins.
Hi, thank you for coming. I don't mind telling you that the idea of giving a lecture filled me with some considerable fear. Lectures I always used to think were given by professors, and there was always an exam at the end, which I never seemed to pass. At the first lecture I attended, on my first day at university in Yale, I sat in the front row of a room filled with 200 people. When the professor walked out on stage, I stood up, which was the way we'd been taught to do in England. When the professor walked out on stage, he walked out to the center, looked down at me and said, "Can I help you?" It was the only then that I realized that there were 199 people in the room who had not stood up, and they were all looking at me. In later lectures I attended, sitting down, I often heard writers hide themselves in smokescreens of literary theory and politics. The parts I remembered were when they talked about themselves. These glimpses into their lives were what I carried home with me and what I remembered when I reread their books. So as much as I can tonight, I'll try to chart my own course towards becoming a writer in America. And as this is a lecture, there will be an exam afterwards, and I expect you all to pass. On my 16th birthday, I was an exchange student in Germany. The family with whom I stayed were Prussian and had fled from the Russians at the end of the war. My father took me aside at one point, my exchange father, on my birthday party. He took me into a room and closed the door. He said he was going to tell me something that he had not even told his own sons. What he told me was that on his 16th birthday, he had been drafted into the Waffen-SS and sent into the Ardennes forest to fight the Americans in December of 1944. He said that after 2 days of fighting, his group of 17 had been reduced to 7. Then they came to the edge of a pine forest, a field spread out in front of them. On the other side were the Americans. An SS officer ordered the 7 boys to fix bayonets and advance across the field. He said if he saw anyone's face, that is, if any of them turned around, he would shoot them himself. So they all started running. The father said he could see the sparkle of the American guns. He could see men standing and firing and ducking back down. After a while, he said, he couldn't stand it anymore, and he did look back to see what had happened to his friends. And what he found was that he stood alone in the field. All of the others had fallen. So he threw up his arms and fell down, pretending to be dead. That night, he said, the Americans walked out into the field and looted the bodies of the Germans. He said he remembered being picked up and thrown down on his back. His watch and his belt buckle and passbook were taken. When the Americans had gone, he crawled back into the woods. It was the only story he told me. He was afraid of what his own sons might say about him being in the SS, so he tried to tell me first. On my way back to school in England, I stopped in the Ardennes and walked through the areas that he'd spoken about. Deep in one pine forest, I found things pretty much as he had left them half a century before. There were holes in the ground covered with logs, and under the logs were blankets and food tins and old helmets, and at one point I even found a pair of boots set up against the tree. But strangely enough, what I didn't see were the boots. I saw the poor American running away barefoot through the snow 50 years before. I had a sense of some huge story cut short and never told. At that moment, the world seemed to be filled with stories that had been left untold, perhaps only muttered now and then by old men and women on their way towards senility. Even now in antique markets, I'll pick up an old cigarette case and see its silver rubbed smooth by someone's palm over the years, or see old boots or an old hat, and I'll get this idea of stories not told. I think it was there in that pine forest that I decided I would be a writer. And as soon as I decided, it was as if I had always known. There was no great thunderclap of knowledge. In fact, it was a rather quiet revelation. The seeds of it had been planted years before by my mother and father, although they had no idea of it at the time. My father traveled to Canada as a javelin thrower for the British Olympic team in 1952. He stayed in Canada because he was Welsh and came from a family of coal miners and policemen, and he didn't want to work in the mines. He married a translator for the team, and in order to earn enough money to put himself through university, he worked for Shell Oil in Alaska. After I was born, we moved to America. My parents developed a fear that I might somehow end up back in the Welsh mines, and the way to ensure it that never happened was to send me to private school, not in America, but in England, where the social barriers are that much more severe. So from the age of 6 to 19, I was in boarding school. First in Oxford at a place called the Dragon School, where when I arrived, I thought I was going to a party, and later at a school called Eton, which is near Windsor. I had my American friends and I had my British friends. The two were very distant. Often the American holidays wouldn't coincide with the British holidays, and I would spend weeks by myself. And in this relative solitude, the world of stories and of storytelling first became important to me. I became a great follower of television. In fact, once I made a recording of all the TV songs I knew, and at night in the dormitory in England, while the other boys slept with their teddy bears, I used to lie with my ear pressed against the tape recorder, listening to the songs. I tried to be as quiet as I could, but sometimes my blankets would suddenly be pulled off my bed, and a teacher would be standing there saying, "For God's sake, Watkins, you're making us all deaf." And back home in America, I studied the FBI posters of criminals who were on the run. Sometimes there were rewards. I'd write down their names and the crimes, and I'd go looking for them in the supermarkets, searching for the scar-faced crooks. Then sometimes the police would pick me up. They'd think I was an American student who had run away from classes. So they'd put me in the police car and ask me where I went to school. The Dragon School, I'd tell them, and they'd never heard of it. And I'd end up sitting in the police station waiting for my parents to get home, while all the criminals were still out robbing banks and other people were collecting the rewards. This is where the writing started. As children, we often spend more time in our imagination than we do in the real world. When we get older, our imaginations get smaller, as concerns of the real world begin to govern our lives. In the end, the only times when our minds can wander freely is in our sleep. And so often we return from the world of our dreams with nothing, because we so easily forget. The other way, of course, is to lose ourselves briefly in a book, when we become the temporary follower of someone else's fantasy. I feel as if this process was slowed down for me. With all my American friends still in school, I had more time to invent companions and adventures we set out on. And of course, if I'd known I might one day invent people and write about them and actually get paid for it, I might have started a lot sooner. I wrote stories then, not for publication, but somehow to confirm the existence of my imagined friends. Even now, there's always a time in writing a book when you spend more time with characters you've invented than with people who actually exist. Carefully, you cannibalize them to populate your books, hoping that the seams of the reinvented men and women do not show. In the labyrinth of your novel, you have a sense of falling forward into the computer screen. You find yourself preferring the landscape of your imagination to that of the physical world. You become a citizen of the land inside your head, and sometimes it seems as if you will never find your way out. Another important factor in steering me towards writing was this business of traveling constantly back and forth across the Atlantic 6 times a year. I was always trying to slide unnoticed from one group of people to another. And it's a great mistake to assume that because the Americans and the English speak the same language, that they are in fact the same people. For a long time, I would speak with an English accent in England and with an American in America. But still, this wasn't enough. I would arrive back home and find my friends speaking what appeared to be a different language. The slang had changed. It was like losing a secret password that would let you into the ranks. I began to feel like the governor of some mid-Atlantic colony with a population of 1. But this made writing easier. It was never a struggle to shrug off the skin of one character and become wrapped in the identity of another. The landscapes had their own identities, and I began to think of the two countries not as separate, as not only apart in distance, but also apart in time. I remember when I left America, I used to think of it going into a state of hibernation, the way New England might be on an early winter's morning with fog in the trees and the water on the bay flat calm like a mirror, people asleep. And the only unscheduled visit I ever made to America was to attend the funeral of my father. And strangely enough, that's exactly how it was. I remember getting up at 4 a.m. and walking through the fog, not able to see more than 5 paces in front of me, and surprised at how precisely I'd imagined this place, sleeping while I was away from it. It was only when I left my schooling in England and began as a student at Yale University that I realized how unusual my time in England had been and how much of a mark it might have left on me. I think back on those years, and it seems to be someone else standing there in my memory. The discipline did not belong in this century, and neither did the uniforms. The uniforms every day of the year were black and white pinstripe trousers, toes. We had to be able to see our faces and the toe caps of our shoes. We wore white shirts with separate collars, 2 gold studs, one at the front, one at the back, and white bow ties, waistcoats, and tailcoats like an opera conductor. The school rule was they had to have coats that covered the back of our knees, the back of our tailcoats, and the only ones we could find were greatcoats. And people used to say that seeing us come out of chapel in the morning was like watching Napoleon retreat from Moscow. And as for the discipline, there was once a teacher named Mr. Slade. Whenever he had a test, you could always tell because the breakfast hall in the morning would be this incantation of ego me, mihi me, tu te. I can still say all the Latin, but I can't remember what it means. I can say some Greek too. What would happen is that Mr. Slade would pick on you, and you stood up and you said your incantation. And if you got it right, you got a red mark next to your name. If you got it wrong, you got a black mark. And on Friday afternoons, he'd tally them. And if you had 3 red marks, you'd get a chocolate bar. But if you had 3 black marks, he'd beat you. So there were times when I would arrive at Mr. Slade's study on a Friday afternoon, collect a chocolate bar for getting 3 red marks, and then have to bend over and get beaten for getting 3 black marks. It did change me. I don't think I'll ever know how much. It's been 10 years since I left Eton, and only in the last 6 months have I even considered writing about it. What it taught me was that if you want to write about a place, you must first leave. When you return, you'll discover those things that you took for granted, both in the place and in yourself. There must be a stretch of time between an experience and writing about that experience. Often when you have something to say, it seems best not to write from your own life at all, but to borrow from a different place and time. I had a picture of how I thought the life of a writer might be. I imagined Hemingway and Fitzgerald swinging drunk from the chandeliers of Paris. For a while, I thought I'd have to go to Paris if I wanted to write, as if the city itself would make me a writer. Meanwhile, I had friends who were leaving for New York and London and Rome, all looking for the same Midas touch that would turn them into the painters, photographers, and actors that they wanted to be. They would end up trying so hard to be writers that no writing was ever created. They would end up saying the biggest lie, the most often told lie in New York City: I'm not a waiter, I'm an artist. Nevertheless, for me, America has always been the place to live and to work. It's a land of infinite possibility, where I do not feel bound by social convention or my family's past or by any political pressure. There's a vast amount wrong with America, and I think that the reason for this is simply that the boundaries of infinite possibility do not stop at the boundaries of the law. For a writer, America has writing programs. Dozens of universities offer scholarships to men and women, giving them time to concentrate only on their work. The Paris of the 1920s, where you could live and work cheaply, is the writing program of today. The guru teachers of literature no longer hold court in the cafes or attic rooms above le Boulevard Saint-Germain. Today the same advice is offered in classrooms. What you learn in these programs is that writing cannot be taught. What can be taught is the discipline needed to write. You learn what you must do, and you see some of your friends drink themselves stupid night after night, and you learn what you should not do. There's no clear path towards getting published. If you just send a book to a literary agent, the chances are it will never be read. When I sent out my first couple of manuscripts, I used to put a small amount of glue between page 4 and page 5, so that if it was opened, the glue would be broken. And the amount of times I received my manuscripts back, turned to page 4 and page 5, and the glue would still be intact, despite the fact that I would get a long printed letter saying how much they liked the book, but just couldn't use it. And there's no point really sending it straight to an editor either. You can't get an editor without an agent, and without an agent you can't get an editor. It's catch-22. What you need is for someone to introduce you to their agent. The writing programs are the closest thing to formalizing these introductions. But once you are introduced, you're on your own. The greatest change in my life came when I learned that my first book would actually be published. Suddenly, the countless hours spent scribbling at a desk in the middle of the night had paid off. Suddenly, the stack of paper that had been living on my desk had sprung to life. Now it was actually a book. I remember that my agent had kept me waiting for an entire day for confirmation that the book had been accepted. I'd always tried to imagine what great thing I would do when I finally published a book. Well, what I ended up doing was going out and buying a new pair of socks because I had worn out my old ones by pacing on the floor while I waited for my agent to call. A lot of things happened then that I'd never have predicted. What most surprised me was the way in which people who'd been my greatest critics, the ones who told me to get a real job, were the first to turn around and tell me they knew I could do it. They said they had been with me all the way. The other thing was the way it set me apart from friends who were also writing. Some of them just stopped being friends. There was almost a sense that I had betrayed them, that the idea had always been not so much to publish, but to live in a constant state of suffering for your art. And I was surprised at how quickly the excitement died down. Within an hour of that phone call from my agent, I'd stopped saying to myself, "You're publishing a book." Suddenly I began to think, "You have to publish another book." I discovered that writing is pretty much a 9-to-5 job, just like everything else. And I found that far from being an advantage to be your own boss, you're sometimes harder on yourself than any employer would ever be. It sets you apart from your university friends who keep asking when you're going to get that real job. 2 weeks ago, my father-in-law put his arm around me and said in a quiet voice, "Where does the money come from?" We are conditioned to put on our suits in the morning and to leave the house and not to return home until the end of the day. I think we're conditioned not to enjoy our jobs at all. The discipline we're taught to face is discipline from the outside and not from within us. I heard a story about the writer John Cheever, who found himself in the position anyone has gone through, who's been through this condition, but who sees the job keep them at home. He used to watch out the window at all his friends getting into cars every morning, leaving for work, and then it would be just him and the postman and young mothers until people came home from work. It was driving him crazy. So he put on a suit first thing in the morning after his breakfast, went down to the basement, took off the suit, sat there all day in his underpants typing. At 5 o'clock, he would ring a bell, and then he would get dressed back in his suit, come back upstairs, and that would be the end of his day. Well, when I first heard this, I thought Cheever must have been mad, until one day I sat down at my desk and realized I was wearing a tie and a jacket and had no excuse. In the end, of course, you just do whatever works best, which is what gives rise to the stories of Wagner keeping rotten apples in his desk because the smell helped him to think, or Goethe dunking his head into a bucket of ice water to clear his thoughts. Now I look on eccentricity as a gift more than a hindrance. One of the great problems for everyone involved in the arts is how to make enough money to have the time to write. Eventually, of course, you hope that someone will pay for your books, but it never starts out that way. At law school, I had a job where I sold credit cards for Xerox machines. People would come and buy them. I had an office. I had my own coffee machine, my own telephone. For a week, for 2 hours a day, I would sit there and scribble away for perhaps the 5 minutes that I had spare. And then after the first week, people stopped coming. And after 4 weeks of people not showing up, I finally went down to the basement to see what was going on. And the Xerox machines were gone. I asked someone what had happened, and apparently there'd been a big malfunction a month before. And so I was sitting there at my office 2 hours a day with no one showing up. And it began to be like a Kafka story. I was still collecting my computer-printed paychecks. And I thought to myself, well, shall I do the honest thing and turn myself in? And then I said, what are you thinking? And I stayed there for another 3 or 4 months and wrote my first book. In the holidays, I ended up working on deep-sea fishing boats off the coast of New England. It's good pay, very good pay. There's no insurance. The captain used to unload cash from a garbage bag. We would stuff it down our underpants and run away and hide it. There were no last names used, no social security, no taxes, and no insurance. So one day, when I got my head smacked in by a big piece of metal on the fishing boat, I had to actually go back out to sea to pay for the damage that had been done before. I know people, men and women, who've worked on oil rigs, who've been garbage collectors, butchers, lumberjacks. From this you learn, a touch masochistically perhaps, that hardship not only pays well, but it can provide the best material for writing. So you find yourself searching out these hardships, stretching further to lure people into the bounds of your imagination and your books. But then something else comes along. For years I waited for some celestial vision that would tell me it was time to get married. I imagined a scene with a hand coming out of the cloud and tapping me on the shoulder and whispering in my ear. My girlfriend waited too, until she couldn't take it anymore. And then it was her hand that came down on my shoulder and her voice that said, time to get married. Suddenly, I was faced with the stability that I'd taught myself to do without. It did sort of sneak up on me. It's very comfortable. It brings a type of calm and sanity that can come from nothing else. But sometimes I must ask myself, where are your plans to sail alone across the Atlantic, or the plan you had to walk across the Hindu Kush? Now I also teach. I teach at a school near Princeton in New Jersey. If anybody told me I would once be a teacher, I would have laughed at them. And if they'd told me I'd actually enjoy it, I would have been insulted. What I enjoy is what I see of myself in them. I see the wide-eyed sense of having the world in the palm of your hand. And in a way they do. They have the strength and the curiosity to do anything they want, without the weight of responsibility to mortgages, families, and car payments. What distresses me is that many of these students who want to become writers, who want to and could, never will. The pressure from their parents to recoup the money that's been spent on their educations, this pressure is so strong that these students will be 50 years old and close to retirement before they realize that they didn't want to be doctors or lawyers after all. Schiller wrote, "Hold fast to the dreams of your youth." As far as I can see, this is what the writer does. That's why the job is never done. There's no sense of retirement. Because the dreams of our youth are precisely this, to endure. And if a writer's books endure, then so will the writer, farther than the bounds of his or her own life. The writer will have captured an undying fragment of that youth, which is the greatest prize. It would be easier for me to say all these grand things if I were an old man. I think when you get older, your life becomes more like a fable. You can look back and see the moral of the story, the things you have been moving towards without even knowing. Before then, the story is still writing itself, and you don't yet know the themes by which you will be remembered. So, when I'm an old man, I would like to come back and talk to you again, and then with grey hair, or at the rate things are going, no hair, and perhaps half blind from staring at the computer, then I will tell you what story my life has become. Thank you. Of your novel, and there are many things about the past that I went through. For example, one of the conditions that my wife agreeing to marry me was that I never send my children to Eton. And I said, well, I wouldn't do that. And she said, you don't know that. She said, I've seen your friends and I've seen the way they act, and I don't trust that part of you. It's true that for some people who've been through that education, they call it the cloistered elite, and it's possible to stay in that system your entire life, provided you do a few narrow jobs. You can be a certain kind of banker, a certain kind of lawyer, and a certain kind of politician. And if you do that, what they call the old school tie network will keep you very comfortably for the rest of your life. But what will happen is if you leave that, you find that it's as if the school has taught you that the world owes you a living, and it doesn't. For example, I mean, the reactions to that can be quite severe. For example, 4 people that I know out of a graduating class of 70 killed themselves within the first year of graduating from Eton. If you don't stay within those cloisters, and bearing in mind that it's like the uniform hasn't changed in 130 years, the discipline hasn't changed in a lot longer. You're surrounded by a sense of tradition that's hundreds of years old. I think that it's inescapable. I can remember when I was 15, traveling to Flanders on a little assignment for the school newspaper. We'd been studying the First World War poets, Blunden, Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and I didn't have enough money to stay in a hotel, so I pitched a camp outside one of those large cemeteries outside Zillebeke. And when I woke up in the morning, I was brewing coffee on a wall that separated me from the cemetery. And the first tablet, the first grave that caught my eye, had my school motto written across the top. Now, at that moment, the hair stood up on the back of my head. I remember thinking that I could never get away from it, not ever. And in fact, in order to get away from it, I had to leave the country. The connotations with having gone to that sort of schooling are so severe that once you've done it in England, you can't go back. So I feel like I had to do pretty much what my father had to do and leave for America. My wife is very much a part of America, and there are parts that I just don't bother to explain. It's something that I can't explain yet. For example, only in the last few months have I ever considered writing about Eton. I opened my diaries. I kept diaries from 1972 to 1982, and I only could bear reading them in the last year or so. And what I found is that nothing that's in the diaries is what I want to write about, because what I want to write about is what I took for granted back then. The things and the uniforms, the discipline, everything that was archaic about it, that's interesting to me now, was so matter of fact then that it's not in the books. And yet, the books, in the diaries, there are scenes that break open memories so clear in my head, and I know they would never reappear if I never looked at those diaries. So it's a slow process, and my wife is part of that slow process. But I think I have to deal with it privately before I can deal with it and my wife. Yeah, that's all.
You don't seem to foster bad feelings towards your parents who needed you.
Yes, I suppose I could. I suppose there are people who do. I think I understand. This is a difficult thing. My father died when I was 15, and I never got the chance to ask him. And that's not to say that my father's reasons for sending me were much more extreme than my mother's. My mother was concerned with me having a good education. But the thing is, you could send a child an American child to a place in America and have that kind of good education. The reason my father sent me was because when he was growing up in England, the people who most intimidated him were the people who had been through that kind of schooling. So it was some sort of bizarre full circle that in order to react against it, in order to prevent me ever ending up back in the upbringing that he had to send me through this severe kind of schooling, which it made it impossible that I would end up back there. His risk, the price he paid was separating from his family. The last time I ever saw a member of my father's family was at Heathrow Airport. I was standing with a group of other Etonians they were leaving for the Pacific, I was leaving for America, and a porter came up, a baggage carrier, and it was my Uncle Bill. I got an uncle who's a porter at Heathrow, and I remember talking to my Uncle Bill, and then he went away, and I turned around and I saw all the Etonians staring at me, and I realized there'd be no way on earth I'd be able to explain to them that my uncle was a porter at Heathrow. I think the only thing I couldn't bear to do to a child, now there are plenty of things I couldn't bear to do to a child that happened at that school, but one of them is to drop someone off at age 6. I said I thought I was going to a party. My father kept telling me, but I wasn't listening. You know, you're age 6 and you don't listen. He kept coming up and shaking my hand, and I was playing with all these other boys, playing cards. And then eventually my father did leave. And I remember going up to the housemaster and saying, "Where's my dad?" And he said he's gone back to America. And I said, "Well, when can I go see him?" Having no idea really how long it took to get to America. And the housemaster said, "You can see him at Christmas." And then I realized that I didn't know when Christmas was either. It just was one of those times when the parents erect a tree and then the snow starts coming down. I just basically gave up hope that I was ever going to get home at all. And I think that to send someone there before they realize what they're doing is a little too harsh. And yet, you can't send someone halfway through that system. When I first arrived at Eton, I had to serve an elder boy. I had to wake him up at 7 in the morning with a cup of tea, lay out his clothes for the day, make his bed when he was in the shower. You can't prepare someone for that unless they've gone through it from the very beginning. That's an excuse. I don't know if it's the real reason. I don't know. I can't bring myself to grudge them.
You sit behind a screen and you start writing,
Right.
and do sentences come naturally, or is it one continuous struggle?
It's never. It can be. Some days are worse than others. I think it is a 9-to-5 job. I think that. Well, for example, it's very easy to write stuff, but the stuff that ends up in the book isn't always the same. For the book that's just most recently been published, the first draft was 770 pages long. The final draft is about 310. So, yeah, there was a time with a Macintosh computer. There's a little thing called a mouse, and you drag it down the screen, and what happens is the screen turns black. So there was a point where for 2 days straight, I was erasing months. It was like tearing pages off a calendar. Months and months and months of work just disappearing. That's about the most masochistic thing I've ever done in my life. So in terms of it being easy to put down the original material, I mean, the reason it was so long was because it involved flying a biplane, and I'd learned to fly a biplane, and what happened was that I couldn't decide for myself which were the most important details. So I put them all in, everything I knew. And what I realized when it came time to cut all this material was that you only need to give the reader a few choice details. And it ended up being stuff that was almost irrelevant, like the smell of the horsehair leather padding around the cockpit rim, the fact that the wicker seats that they sat in creaked, just tiny details, and leaving the rest to the reader. You can never tell that until you finish the book. you get too involved with your characters. They become whole and complete, and when you look at them, you put the book away and you look at them again, you can see the Frankenstein stitching that's stuck them together. So again, there must not only be time between an experience and writing about it, but there must be time between the original filling of the blank page and going back and turning it into what eventually becomes a book, I think.
But you actually stop at 5, even if you're going good.
Stop at 5. You have to be disciplined about stopping. Yeah. I mean, unless I've been goofing off during the day, it has to be disciplined about the hours that I put in, and always take a day off, at least one day off per week. So, you see, if that doesn't get done, you become sloppy, and you let yourself off the hook, and soon enough you're doing, I think, which is one of the greatest threats, perhaps to a young writer, perhaps to any writer, which is spending too much time talking about your writing and not enough, and living in the right cafes, smoking the right funny cigarettes, wearing the right leather jackets, and not doing enough writing. There.
Would you mind telling more about discipline, or when, as you want free space, you are loving as an author or as a creator?
Well, I think that. Okay. I think that, particularly for a young writer, there are several dangers, and I don't know if this applies just to America. The American book industry is very large. I find a big difference, for example, between the British industry and the American industry. The British industry seems almost like a cottage industry compared to the muscle of the American publishing network. I think what happens to a lot of young writers who are searching for their own space, having perhaps acquired their discipline, searching for their own identity within the publishing world, get pulled in two different directions. I think the agents will start to, if a book has been successful, they'll pick up on those parts which were successful, those parts which worked in the book, and the agent will say, do more of this and you make more money. And the editor will say, look, they'll start comparing you to so-and-so, so do more of this. It's just like somebody else's author. And you're stuck in the middle with your instincts telling you to go a certain way, but with these very powerful lures telling you to go a different way. And I think what happens to a lot of young writers is that they start obeying voices other than their own. And what happens is they'll take a book, and if their book has been successful, they'll take the successful parts and they'll build on those only. So you end up with this pyramid, a good stable base reduced to some sort of, it's like taking a knife and sharpening it until there's no knife left. You end up with this, I don't know if this is coming across clearly, it's taking only the best parts of their book, the parts that have worked, and being afraid to experiment with new stuff. So sometimes you end up with authors that may have done very well off their first or second book, just repeating themselves until you feel like they've laid down their last card. It's almost too easy to start naming names, but I'm not going to do that. There aren't that many. I think those are the dangers. And it's also a danger to, I think, once you've done one book, to ease off. The biggest concern, I think, must be the sense of endurance, a sense of a lifelong career. And the trouble is that when you're young, you don't think about it in terms of a lifelong career. You think about it in terms of year to year, or party to party, or week to week sometimes. So, I don't know. That seems to me the danger.
Does it mean that you are not young anymore?
I don't feel it anymore. I don't feel young anymore. There are always times when I think certainly things change, but you never feel young, really. You always feel like you're old. At least I've always felt that way. I always know there are people older than me, which is something. I don't know.
But where does that perspective come from? Does that come from your British education, that you're able to step back and not see yourself as a young man anymore?
I think the thing about young writers, I think people judge the careers of writers. When writers talk to writers, age doesn't seem to be that important. It's how far along you are in your career. So for example, there can be a 65-year-old woman who's produced 2 great books, and then a 30-year-old man who's produced 2 great books. And you see, although they're separated by time, they're not separated by the progress they've made. They may be separated by experience, but it's it's that part of their publishing careers which I think really join them. In terms of just seeing oneself as old, no, I guess I don't. I mean, someone told me the other day that after the age of 25, you start to physically deteriorate. And I laughed at them, and then I went into the bathroom in the restaurant, and I pulled up my shirt and I started pinching at my stomach to see if it was true. Of course there are things. I mean, there are different milestones apart from just aging. But in terms of a book, it's this sense of continuancy which strikes me as the most important.
And one question. What do you think, how much is your opinion, so your classification to young writer or young writer and old or
Well,
someone, how much is that in the connection with the publishing context?
well, I think
Is it in any connection?
publicists make a lot of people being young. There's no doubt. There's no denying that when a publishing house picks someone up who is young, they have the opportunity at least to see it as a lifelong investment. Whereas if someone comes in totters in at the age of 80 with a book, that's fine. You might be able to make a big deal of it, but you can't make a lifelong career out of it. I think that again, I don't know if age is terribly important. I ran out of things to do at a very early age. I was going to be a scientist for a while, and I threw myself wholeheartedly into physics. And at the end of my first term in physics, my physics report came back, and there was only one word at the bottom, and the word was absurd. So I gave up on my scientific career. It fitted in with everything else I was doing. Traveling became important, but it's mostly solitude can turn you into a storyteller. Because back to this idea of when you're a child, you tell yourself stories to keep yourself busy. And the older you grow, it seems to me, the less you're able to wander freely in your imagination. And the time I spent alone, when there was nothing on television, I would invent stories for myself. And that just became the storytelling. So even now, it's important for me to know when non-fiction ends and when fiction begins. This is where the imaginary world collides with the real world. And I feel like, there are very few points in our lives when we can say that our lives have changed irrevocably. But standing in the pine forest in the Ardennes, however many years ago it was, that was a changing point in my life. Because suddenly I wasn't seeing things the same way I used to. And in the weeks following that, I became manic about this sense of the threads of non-fiction stories just falling off the end of the earth and disappearing. And I think where non-fiction ends is where fiction can begin. The third book I wrote about these two men who tried to beat Charles Lindbergh across the Atlantic, it came from seeing a picture of two men in a Sunday newspaper. They were looking out of a cockpit of a plane. In 1926, they had built a plane trying to be the first people to fly across the Atlantic, and they disappeared. But there was a rumor that they'd crashed in the woods in Maine, which would have meant that although they died in the attempt, they were the first people to fly non-stop solo across the Atlantic. So there must have been a point when those two men were on the cusp of total oblivion and immortality. And the story was about the grandson of one of these men who had gone to try and find his grandfather in the Maine woods because he himself had become fixated with this idea of perhaps somehow bringing them back to life. You see, that's what Lindbergh did in the course of one 15-hour journey. As soon as he set foot out on, in Le Bourget and the Paris airfield, he became immortal, like Neil Armstrong when he stepped out on the moon. And yet they'd completely disappeared. And like the grandson, looking at these two brave faces peering at me out of some grainy old black and white picture, I became fixed with the idea that the story had just disappeared. And the fiction of it started to take over in my mind until eventually I felt like I had no choice but to write the book. And I think that's the way it is, that it's time to write a book when you no longer care whether it will be published, what people say about it, or whether it'll even be a good book. So doing your research is very important. Yeah, it's fun too sometimes. Sometimes it's less fun. I'm getting soft, I think. I'm going to easier locations, you see. Like this later, the fourth book I just finished is about it's about something that happens in Ireland. And yet the previous book involved traveling to the Sahara and living there for 2 months. You see, I think it's always a risk to do, although it's a great risk to write about times before I was born, I don't feel restricted by chronology. I don't feel restricted by time, because I think that there are stories that are written hundreds of years ago that can affect us much more strongly than stories written today, simply because of their emotional content and the trials that their characters have to go through. And so it's almost as if I feel like we're not, in the terms of fiction, we're not connected by time and distance, but we're connected by emotions that move like little electrical sparks across the centuries. Sometimes I'll see films or I'll hear stories about things that happened just hundreds of years ago, and they'll be more alive to me than anything I'll be reading in today's newspaper. The research is necessary because in order to pull it off, you have to not only immerse yourself in the landscape, but also in what was the everyday at that time. Now, going to Morocco, where the two men in the fiction of the piece were members of the French Foreign Legion, and in order to do that, I couldn't just open some National Geographic and look at pictures of the Sahara and say that I'd been there and try and fake it. It wouldn't have worked. So I went there and lived there for 2 months, and all I did really was just practically go out of my head. I really didn't think I was ever going to be normal again when I left, just because in times it was so boring, it was so bloody hot, the food was so bad, everybody was stealing my money. There was things that I wasn't able to predict, and yet once I'd left the country, the traces of the traces of the Foreign Legion were only too clear to me. The first trace I found, I'm doing this because the woman who took my backpack, once I arrived at this town in the desert, had these strange earrings, these strange oval earrings, and she was leading me towards the hotel, and I kept trying to see what these earrings were because they had writing on them. And eventually when we reached the steps of the hotel, I realized that her earrings were the dog tags, the identification discs of French Foreign Legionnaires. So there were things there that I just never expected to find, and that's what you have to go to find. And with the first book, I remember sitting in the Imperial War Museum in one of their relic rooms, they call them, just sifting through the junk of what those people used to wear, and also talking to veterans. The atrocity that happens in the book was not done by Germans to Americans, it was done by Americans to Germans, but that would have been unacceptable. So oftentimes it involves warping what you've learned, and oftentimes you stir up things that the people don't want to remember. There were terrible, terrible silences in interviewing the Americans. They'd always spout out something that sounded like it had come out of some Hollywood movie, and then there would be this silence because they run out of sort of prepared stories that they were used to telling people. And you know at that point you're hurting them, and either you say never mind and stop, and they'll stop, or you continue the silence, and eventually things will, like with the diaries, things will emerge from their heads that have stayed hidden for half a century. And the trouble is that you need that stuff for writing. So it can be quite agonizing, but I think it's the most interesting part for me.
You always know how to guard your material.
How to guard it?
To find and to...
No, oftentimes, you see, that's it. Sometimes you don't know what you're going to go. We don't know what you're even looking for. When I got to the Sahara, I didn't have the vaguest idea what I'd find. And in fact, even when I left, I wasn't sure exactly what I could use and what I couldn't. But no. Looking back, it can be made to seem terribly. That's why I never did very well in literature classes, because it would frustrate me to have someone teaching the life of a particular writer or a particular person in history, and everything seemed so deliberate. The program of their writing, the books they wrote, it all seemed on this pre-plotted course, like a chess game with all the moves worked out in advance. And the truth is, it's stumbling from place to place. But that I like too. That's also one of the great pleasures. Not, in fact, knowing what a book will be at the end of it, I think.
There must be a moment that you say to yourself, this is enough.
Aye. Enough research,
Yes.
Sure. Yes, and there's a point where there's too much going on in your head. The walls of my study are lined with cork. And every day, I carry notebooks with me. I also have a string tied on the end of my bed with a pencil and a pencil at the end, because the time when the best ideas come, and you may know this for yourself, is when you're half asleep and you're just about to drift off into unconsciousness, and the best ideas arrive. And you think, well, I'll remember them in the morning. And of course, by the time you get in the morning, there's nothing there. So I've been drawing on the wall lately. Makes me very unpopular at home, but the process of note-taking is extremely important. And everything goes up on the walls of my study until the time when I know it's time to write the book is when I can't stick down any more notes. And then every morning, instead of having just a blank computer screen, go and pull something off the wall, start writing. So
You were going to ask something.
You're a guest of the program that's called American Literature Today. With your background, I'm wondering if you're really representative of American literature today.
Well,
I'd like to ask you, is there something like American literature? Are you representing that? And what's the difference between, let's say, other literature today? And don't you need a backfall back to Europe to get...
Me personally, or literature in general?
In general first, but you in particular.
For myself, I chose to come to America. I had the choice when I was 18 of staying in England or coming to America. Now that choice for me was the choice of being English or choice of being American. I don't think you can live effectively in both. The idea of being stuck in the middle Atlantic is not an appealing one. My training as a writer, or as self-training as a writer, was carried out in America. I still think that if I wasn't in America, I would never be a writer. So I feel like I owe that part of my career to America. In terms of needing a fallback to Europe, I don't think Americans need that. I think that I'm back to the idea that if you want to write about your own country, I think you've got to leave it so that you can understand what you take for granted when you return. So if Europe is the place where people must flee to, then, but I think of people who've chosen the South Pacific instead, or Mexico or Canada as their places of retreat before they return back to America. I don't think American literature suffers by not having any European influence. I don't know if that's a proper answer.
But your voice, if I may say so, the voice that you have your characters speak in is very American, or would you disagree?
I guess it's the voice I feel like I would speak in if I was there.
Yet now you sound very British.
Yes.
And you have a very British...
Well, I don't give the characters accents, that's true. But, once you've had a character born in a certain place, then you must give him the voice that comes from that area.
Well, even your German hero in the first book has an American voice.
Yes, that's just the voice of the whole book. That was just the best I could do at the time. I'm still stuck on this idea of being a phony American coming here.
Nobody give you that idea?
No. I just want to. I know that. I think that I have an American passport, but I also have a British passport. You see, I can only claim allegiance to America for that part of growing up that I did in America. And yet, when I started to write, I started in America. I may travel far afield, but writing started for me in America, even unintentionally, through the loneliness that I had in America. But it continues in America. And through that, if nothing else, then I can claim, I think, to be an American writer. I hope to.
Will you be writing the script of the film?
Yes, I will. The fishing book is being made into a film by a company called Working Title. They did films like Room with a View, My Beautiful Laundrette, A World Apart. It's about South Africa. No, they wanted an all-American story. They thought, well, we'll break into the American market and we'll have this story written, about something truly American by an American. And I could hear their voices rising in pitch when they heard my English accent on the end of the telephone line. But by then it was really too late. So yes, it's being turned into a film. And when I go back now, I've written the screenplay, and they're getting different actors, that they're viewing the actors, and I have to drive up and down the New England coast looking for the right port for the production. So yes, that's quite exciting for me.
Low budget film.
I'm sorry?
It's a low budget film.
No. No, in fact, there's a point in the book where the fishing boat almost gets run over by a tanker. And I had these two guys, producers, putting their heads in their hands saying, it's going to cost $4 million to do this. And it probably will. They were saying, couldn't it be a smaller boat that runs them over? And I thought, no, it won't work. So I think it's a budget around 13 million. So.
You mentioned you listen to a lot of people's stories whenever you situate yourself. And I guess you have to worry about what is truth and what is fabrication. Or do you worry about that at all? There's the story.
I think that certainly I worry about, I'm writing fiction, and because I'm under that umbrella, I don't worry as much about the historical context as I do about the story itself. The story must work before the history is threaded through it. And although it's important not some. I mean, the reason the first book was written was to take a character that one might normally react strongly against. There's a book about this boy joining the SS. It's to take a character that one might normally dismiss because of the historical context. He was in the SS. He was bad. Just get him out of the way. I don't want to hear about it anymore. And you see, for me, I had to think about that because this was a man I'd been calling father for the last 6 months, suddenly reveals himself to be the Darth Vader of the 20th century. And yet his war only lasted 1 week. He was taken prisoner a week later. The idea was to take this character and through the journey of the book to have the reader, if the reader will follow that journey, to have the reader ask at the end, what would I have done under similar circumstances? Now that much I owe accuracy in history. So the accuracy comes from anecdotes. But you see, with fiction, in the third book, with the flyers, the closer I moved to writing the book, the further it got from non-fiction. So I find myself not restricted by that, I think. Yeah.
You seem a little bit frustrated with the sort of standard education that you've gotten in some ways. I'm wondering if you've developed a different system for your students, and if you have you gotten results that are surprising?
That's right. The more eccentric you are as a creative writing teacher, the better they will like you. I originally went in with a list of maxims, about 60 things of what to do, what not to do when you're a writer. One by one, they all got shot down until I was left with nothing. Sometimes I would go into class and have a prepared speech, and I would say it in 5 minutes and realize I had about 2 hours in front of me with nothing but blank space. So what I'm doing nowadays is, I know you can't teach people how to write. You can't teach style. You just can't make writers. They've got to make themselves. What you can teach is the discipline behind it. And for me, that comes in forms of like note-taking, and also sensory, immediate connection with certain senses. For example, for everybody in the room, there'll be certain smells, certain sounds, certain tastes that will rocket them back into their childhood, or even into yesterday, but it will do that for them. There are these triggers that can be launched by certain senses. So, for example, about 6 weeks ago in the class, I brought in coffee, and I ground the coffee, and then I poured the coffee out on the table, and soon enough the whole room smelled like coffee. And I made them sit down and not write about coffee, but write about what coffee does to them. I bring in Cartier-Bresson slides and make them look at the slide, make them think of what it does to them, what it reminds them of, and have them write something from their own lives. I think this trigger mechanism is something that evolves, but I think you can help people with that, whereas I do not believe you can teach people writing styles, or should not.
What did you learn then in the creative writing course that you took?
I learned, most importantly, that there is no clear path towards getting published. I learned, as I say, that the perception of what we think a writer is often so far removed from what a writing career really is, that the people who set out on what they consider the more glamorous path in fact aren't writers at all. There's this business of moving to Paris to be, hang out in the Café de Magot, thinking that the ghost of Hemingway was going to sit down next to you, pull the pencil out of your hand and start writing. It doesn't happen. So I think that...
Didn't you learn about techniques, narrative techniques?
No. We just met once a week to workshop what we had written. I think the danger is that with every writing program, just as with every writing community, there's a guru, there's somebody at the top, and somebody at the top can help you either get published or you just follow him you follow him to too great a degree. A good teacher won't let that happen. A good teacher won't say. A good teacher will have the good sense not to only make progress with what he or she likes, to understand that there must be several judges for one particular piece. So the best classes in the ones I'm teaching are when the students sort of stand up and very sheepishly say, "You don't know what the hell you're talking about." So those are actually the most rewarding times, because they're starting to think for themselves. That's what I learned.
Thank you.
Yes, when somebody is reading from your book, a small part like Mr. Van Vliet's, what do you feel? Do you think, oh my God, did I write that? Or do you think, wow, I did a good job in writing that?
Well, I'm glad he chose that part, because I was able to think good things rather than bad. I think it's always strange to hear stuff read out. It's strange to see the book published is strange. The book doesn't belong to you when you see it in galley form, which is typed out, printed form. And from that stage on, then there's a cover. And I think the closer it gets to reaching the bookshelves, the less it really belongs to you. When someone actually finally reads it out, sometimes the best possible reaction is to sort of sit back and let someone tell me the same story again, and to still enjoy that same story. And so that's the best. At worst, I can never listen to radio broadcasts that I've been on. I don't know why. I can't do that. But like with the film now, you see it's being seen through different eyes. I was once at a lecture with E.L. Doctorow, who talked about his film Ragtime, and said that it was the biggest lesson of his life that he had maintained what they call kill rights on the book, which means that every scene would have his final approval. And what happens is the film was this long, lumbering dinosaur of a thing that never took off. And what you have to learn is that all it is pictures bouncing out of your head off the page into someone else's head, and you cannot expect them to see the same things. So I think it's a good thing that the further a story spreads through different publications, through translations, the less it really belongs to you, and the more you must share it. The fiction isn't written. You don't write. It's not a diary. You write it for other people, and you can only hope that they see it in their own way.
But you can never judge how we read your books in Dutch or in any other language. It must be very strange how the perception of any other language is in your language. You got to think about.
I have my own translators. No, it's true. It is strange. It is strange to look through a book and to recognize it through nothing but the exclamation marks. Yeah. So.
Okay, shall we end at this note, or are there other more urgent questions? In that case, Paul Watkins, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Okay. Well, thank you, Paul and Rick, and thank you all. You promised to come back.
Sure.
So when will that be? Yeah, when is your hair gone? 20 years?
No, maybe.
Maybe you'll come back before. Okay, we set a date.
Thank you.
Huh? Okay. We are now planning our next season, because this was the last lecture of American Literature Today for this season. And we're planning the new season. If you're not on our mailing list, please leave your name, so you can have all the news of the authors that are coming the next season. We are now in contact with Maya Angelou, Joyce Carol Oates, Nicholson Baker, Joseph Brodsky, who is giving the Huizinga lezing in December, Michael Cunningham, Patricia Highsmith, T.C. Boyle, Norman Mailer, Simon Schama, and John Updike. But it will be very difficult, and it depends upon the final confirmation of sponsors and, of course, of the authors themselves. and the cooperation with the publishing houses. Okay, thank you for coming and hope to see you in the next season. Stay on because there's still coffee and drinks and you can talk to Paul and Rick, and thanks a lot. Bye-bye.